Hi guys, I hope you're all doing really well. So in today's episode, as you probably saw from the title, I am doing a ranking of all of the Scream movies in the franchise. And what I'm going to do is talk about the franchise as a whole first, and then I will rank each of the movies from worst to best and do a little mini review of each of them as we go. So before we start, I just want to say that Scream is possibly the most important horror movie to me. It is not only one of the first ones that I saw along with I Know What You Did Last Summer, but it's also one of my favourites. It's that perfect combination of a genuinely really good movie, but it's also full of very happy nostalgia for me as well. So Scream was originally written by Kevin Williamson, and he was inspired by the real life case of the Gainesville Ripper, and also inspired by other horror movies like Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Prom Night, and When a Stranger Calls. It was originally being produced under the working title Scary Movie, but the producers decided to change the title to Scream. Scary Movie would eventually be used as the title for a series of horror spoof movies. I think that Scream definitely has the most consistency in quality when it comes to movies out of the majority of the horror franchises. I mean, even the worst installments in this franchise are still really good films, and I think that proves how strong Scream is as a franchise on a whole. What's unique about Scream is that there is no Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees returning for each of the movies. It's actually the final girl and the original trio that return for each of the films, and it's the killers that change. And that's another thing that allows Scream to stand out from a lot of its other peers, is the whodunit element. I mean, I absolutely love being able to try and sleuth out the mystery within each film. And talking of the original trio as well, I think that Scream, in my opinion, has the best final girl of any horror movie, hands down. I cannot really explain to you what Sidney Prescott means to me in a personal way since I first saw her in Scream in my teenage years. I don't mind admitting, as sad as it might sound, that if I was having a particularly tough day, I would think of a Sidney Prescott quote and I would use it as a bit of a mantra to help me get through that day. I think what makes her such a likeable character is how relatable she is and how human she feels. She feels very real, and we see a lot of growth in her character throughout the movies. She's strong and resilient, funny and vulnerable as well. I mean, yeah, she kicks ass, don't get me wrong, but she also cries and feels the weight of the grief at losing her friends and her loved ones. She's not superhuman either. She bleeds and bruises just like anybody else. And she's also a very caring character and gives a lot back to the other characters within the movies. I mean, she works for the crisis team in Scream 3. She helps to guide and offers support to the new victims in Scream 4 and Scream 5. And she also acts like a surrogate younger sister to Dewey after the death of Tatum in the first Scream. I think that Neve Campbell is incredible as Sidney Prescott, and it's definitely down to her acting ability that really adds a level of sort of meatiness to the character. She has this incredible ability to just be so vulnerable and absolutely break your heart. There's one scene in Scream 2 after Derek has been attacked in the sorority house, and you can just see the look on Sydney's face as her eyes well up with tears as she realises that it's happening again. And then there's another one in Scream 3 in the police precinct between her and Detective Kincaid, and that scene really showcases Neve Campbell's acting abilities. And Gale Weathers and Dewey Riley provide the perfect support for Sydney while also being very capable protagonists in their own right. I think Gale probably has the biggest character arc out of all three of them, although after watching Scream 5 I would say that Dewey gives her a bit of a run for her money. In the beginning she's much more of an anti-hero, she has a very sharp tongue and she makes some morally questionable decisions, but at her core she is a very strong and determined woman, and I think a good person as well. And her personal character arc and journey within Scream 2 is actually one of my favourite aspects of that film. We see that for the first time she's actually emotionally involved in the situation and the people involved, and she can't remain detached from it anymore, and we see the toll that that takes on her. I mean, Gale is always a joy to watch, whether she's the anti-hero or whether she is our hero. She's always a joy, and she adds so much humour to the films as well. And Dewey is an unusual hero for a film. He's actually an unusual love interest as well, and he's quite goofy in the earlier movies, but he's very funny. One of my favourite Dewey scenes is in the original Scream, where he's talking to his boss, the sheriff, and the sheriff is having a stress cigarette, and Dewey's at the side of him having a stress ice cream, and it just cracks me up every time that I see that scene. But he's not just a two-dimensional character that's just included for laughs. He is genuinely likeable. He's sensitive and supportive and endearing. And like I said earlier, he acts as a surrogate big brother to Sidney and Randy in the second film as well. And I think what his goofiness does is that it allows you to forget that he's actually quite a good cop. In the films where it's not in Woodsboro, he is always liaising with the cops of that local area. He removes files on Sidney for safety in Scream 3, and he actually has pretty good instincts as well. Although to be fair, he nor Gale or Sidney are ever actually smart enough to figure out who the Ghostface killers are despite all of their detective work. I just want to preface this ranking by saying that there is not a single film on this list that I dislike. I absolutely love all of them. And apart from my first place and my fifth place, the middle three are all much of a muchness. They're all interchangeable. And to be honest with you, my genuine ranking would probably look like this. But that would be pretty boring. So I have forced myself to prise them apart with a crowbar and actually make an order for you. Okay, so starting off the ranking, coming in at fifth place is Scream 4. Now, for the longest time after its release, I felt like this was my second favourite in the franchise. I definitely rewatched it a lot and I, would go to grab it as a comfort movie. But over time, and especially with this latest Scream marathon, I've come to realise that it's actually my least favourite. I personally think this is the weakest in the franchise. I think it's great that we return to Woodsboro and we check in with these characters after a 10-year gap, and I also think it's interesting to see the effect of the original Woodsboro attacks on the newer generation, seeing the contrast between the people who actually lived through it and the people who are only really aware of it through legend and the Stab movies. I loved that Dewey is now the sheriff. It's like we've gone full circle and we get a much more serious portrayal of him in this film as well. And it's very entertaining watching Gale Weathers try and be, the wife of the sheriff in a small town. Scream 4 does have some really strong new characters as well. I absolutely love Kirby. I think she's fantastic. She's like the new horror movie geek, taking over the reins from Randy. And I liked Detective Hoss, I think he is, Detective Hoss and Deputy Perkins. I love their little self-aware conversation that they have in the police patrol car where they're very aware that they're basically in a horror movie. I'm not, however, really a fan of the addition of Deputy Judy. I know that she's meant to be a red herring, but she just really comes across as creepy more than anything. And I know she makes a comment early on in the film that she wishes she was involved in the original investigations, and she's excited that she's involved in these new ones, but she's overbearing with it at times. And I think she's also meant to represent Dewey in the first film, but what David Arquette could do naturally and effortlessly, Marley Shelton, I think it is, that plays Judy, she just seems like she's trying too hard. But I will say that I did enjoy Judy more in Scream 5. I'm also not really a fan of the look of Scream 4. For some reason they decided to go down the route of this light, blurry, overexposed filter, and it just gives it much more of a dreamlike state, and a lot of the scenes the light just seems like this strange heavenly glow, and it just makes it stand out against the other films in the franchise. I think the killers in Scream 4 are pretty good. Well, one of them's not as good. I think that Jill's motives are interesting. The idea of her wanting social media fame for essentially nothing, for basically just something that happened to her. And if you bear in mind that influencers and social media fame was not what it is today back in 2011, but Scream has always been pretty good at being ahead of its time. But as entertaining as it was to watch Jill beat herself up, I think the character lost something when they moved it to the hospital. She ends up just becoming this whiny, annoying, entitled little brat. Now, before this next entry, I just want to remind you that I do not dislike any of these movies. But coming in at fourth place is Scream 5. So the reason why Scream 5 is in fourth place is because even though I absolutely loved it, I have only seen it the one time. And I've learned from Scream 4 that I loved that originally, but that one didn't stand the test of time. That has slipped down the ranking. And I just think that with a few more rewatches and after a year or so, I think Scream 5 will just naturally fit into its actual place in the ranking. But for now, it's in 4th place. I did do a standalone review for Scream 5, so if you're interested in my more in-depth thoughts in it, don't forget to go and check that out if you haven't already. Just a heads up though, that is actually a spoiler review just in case you haven't seen the film yet. I think that Scream 5 is an incredible sequel and an incredible installment in the franchise, and that is really saying something considering that it is the 5th film in the franchise, and it's also the first one without Wes Craven or Kevin Williamson, but I think that it's really, it fits really well into the franchise through tone and look and quality. Scream 5 is a very striking looking movie. In fact, some of the scenes in Scream 5, their cinematography and colour palette, they make them some of my favourite scenes out of all of the movies. All of the movie is shot really well, and they do a really good job with the pacing as well. To say that it's a 2-hour long film, it's probably longer than it needs to be, and at no point does it ever feel like it's dragging on. The kills are constructed and set up really well as well. They do a really good job in building up tension and playing with your expectations, and I think that the jump scares are really effective in this film as well. This film feels like it's the most emotive and emotional within the franchise. I think the majority of that is down to the return of the legacy characters. There are some really wonderful and moving scenes between Gale and Dewitt and Sidney, and David Arquette is really giving his all in this portrayal. I'm not sure if Scream 5 has the strongest new characters, but I did really love the twins, Chad and Mindy Meeks-Martin, especially Mindy. Scream 5 does a really good job with its meta storytelling and commentary on the state of horror at the moment, talking about requels, taking it back to the beginning, which is all the rage since Halloween 2018 was released, while also being a requel itself. And that's another thing that Scream 5 balances really well. It reboots itself enough to appeal to a newer audience, but it's also still pleasing to long-time fans by linking back to the past and bringing back the legacy characters and taking everything back to the beginning. Okay, so the next two were really, really hard for me to distinguish between. In fact, I'll be honest, I think I only really truly decided just before filming this. But coming in at number 3 is Scream 2. But to be honest with you, there is an absolute nano fraction of difference between this and the previous one. Like I said earlier, the middle 3 are all interchangeable, and it's a hair width difference between them. So Scream 2 was released less than a year after the release of the first film. Kevin Williamson had played around with sequel ideas while writing the script for the original film. He considered the idea of Sidney in college and there being a ghost face copycat killer. He actually pitched the sequel ideas along with the original Scream, thinking it would give it more of a chance of being picked up by studios. The movie faced production difficulties after the script was leaked online, and they had to rewrite who the killers were, which is why some of the aspects of the film and some of the character behaviour doesn't really make sense 100%. Mickey was never originally intended to be one of the killers. They actually originally played around with the ideas of Mrs. Loomis, Derek the boyfriend, Cotton Weary and Hallie the roommate. As strong as Scream 2 is, it does have its weaknesses for me. I think the main one is probably that god-awful lunch hall scene.
I love you, isn't that what life is made of? And though it worries me to say.
No. And I'm not really a fan of Derek the Dud. No offence, Jerry O'Connell, you play him very well. It's just, I find him boring, that's all. And of course, my other main issue with Scream 2 is that it kills off one of my favourite characters in Scream. Well, one of my favourite characters in horror overall, when they kill off Randy.
There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
I think that Scream 2 possibly has some of the best kills in the franchise. The death scenes are all set up really well. They never rush with them. They build them up over time, stretching them out and taking the time and building up a lot of tension in the meantime. I think the best example of this is the car crash scene. Cece's death is another really good example in the film as well, really playing on her isolation in the house and making really good use of the space of the big building as well. Although it always bugs me that she doesn't just leave the house, walk out of the house, walk to the party, to safety. I think if she had, she would have survived. And as much as I hate it and it makes me cry every time I watch it, I have to admit that Randy's death scene is really effective as well. I mean, most of us feel safe in daylight in a very public area, and a lot of kills in horror films are done at night, or at least in the dark. But Randy's is done in the middle of the day on the college campus, surrounded by people. For some reason, Scream 2 feels like the darkest installment in the franchise. I mean, each of the film has some pretty dark subject matter within them, but this one just seems to be missing that lighter comedic tone that the others have, and I really feel a sense of grief and heaviness through this one. I really enjoy the team of Gale and Dewey teaming up to investigate in this one as well, and I think that we have some of the best character interaction scenes in this one as well. I love when Randy and Sidney are talking about the attacks at the cinema the night before, and when Dewey and Randy are talking in the cafeteria of the college, and then the one where Dewey and Riley and Gale are all together in the college campus as well. I also really love Mickey as a character as well in this. I think Mickey the student is likeable, or entertaining at least, with his sharp tongue towards the sorority sisters, his funky dance moves, his geeking out over movies, and his supporting of Sidney as well. And Mickey the killer is also really entertaining. There's a lot of scene chewing going on, and I think considering he was never intended to be the killer, this is really impressive. I just love his bizarre performance. I love the addition of the in-universe stab movies as well in Scream 2. I think it allows them to be really creative with their self-awareness and meta-commentary in later films. But Stab 2 actually does a really good job of its meta-commentary on sequels. Okay, and coming in at number 2, cue stuff being thrown at the screen, but coming in at number 2 is Scream 3. Okay, now let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, this is often considered the worst installment in the franchise, and a few years ago I would have fully agreed with you. I didn't like this film for a long time and considered it my least favourite. But in recent years, I've really come to appreciate the strengths and qualities in it that I didn't see before. And definitely on this latest Scream marathon, it's probably the one that I had the most fun with, and currently stands as my second favourite in the franchise. Scream 3 is undoubtedly the goofiest installment in the franchise, but what's interesting is that it also has some of the darkest subject matter in it when delving into Maureen Prescott's backstory and her trauma in Hollywood. Scream has always been slightly ahead of its time, and in Scream 3 it's no different when it's making commentary on sketchy executive producers taking advantage of young female actresses and the idea of Hollywood mansion parties, which people have been aware of for quite a while now, but this was a long time before the Me Too movement. There are actually a couple of scenes in Scream 3 that gave me little goosebumps, and I think that at this point in the movies we have got so much history and so many memories of these characters that it's understandable, and Scream 3 really taps into that. It really plays on emotions and reminiscing. This leads me into two of my favourite aspects of Scream 3 as well. I love the Hollywood setting. I mean, Carrie Fisher cameo, anybody?
I was up for Princess Leia. I was this close. So who gets it? The one who sleeps with George Lucas.
I love that woman. And it's really refreshing after the last two school settings. But as much as I do love the Hollywood setting, I also really enjoy that they have the in-universe film sets of Woodsboro with you've got Tatum's death and the boat and Sidney's bedroom. I think all that is really, really fun. I also love the Randy Meeks cameo. I know that when they killed him off in Scream 2, a lot of fans were really sad about this, and they actually make meta commentary again on this within Scream 3 where they're talking about the killer's probably some annoyed fan because they killed off Randy in Stab 2. But they bring him back for a cameo to please the fans. I did read though that they originally played with the idea of Randy having survived his attack in the second film, and he's actually been hidden away by his family recovering from his attack. But they thought that this was too unbelievable and decided not to go with it. Yeah, sure. That's the one that they don't go with because it's too unbelievable. But yet we have the reality and physics defying voice collector and voice changer. And we have Roman being able to fake having no pulse. But sure, Randy surviving, that's going too far. Scream 3's self-awareness commentary is on point as always, not only commenting on the sketchy executives, but also commenting on the difficulties that movies face with multiple endings and multiple rewrites of a script as well. And the funny thing is, as much as I used to dislike the goofiness of Scream 3, I've actually come to appreciate it as a bit of a rest, or a bit of a change to mix it up after some of the heavier installments. And I also really like the comedy duo of Gale and Jennifer when they're investigating together. Scream 3 is not without its flaws though. I absolutely detest the dead mum hallucinations, always have. I think that they're tasteless, and I think that they stand out like a sore thumb in a franchise that has never included anything else of a supernatural nature. We also unfortunately have a lot less screen time with Sidney Prescott. This was due to difficulties with filming schedules. Another flaw with Scream 3 is that the killer reveal doesn't really pack the same punch, because we don't recognise who the killer actually is. For the whole of the movie, Roman has been wearing glasses, and then in the reveal, he's not. And when I watched the film, I went, who is that? I like who the killer is though. I don't mind that it's Roman, and I don't mind his motive either. The whole idea of him, longing for this mother he never knew, and then when he's rejected, that longing turns into anger and jealousy towards Sidney as he feels like she got the life that he should have had. He has a lot of entitlement issues, a lot like Jill in that sense. Man, everyone is just jealous of Sidney. You've got Roman being jealous of her because he feels like she had the childhood that he should have had. Jill being jealous of her because she has the fame that Jill wants. You even have Gale in some scenes being jealous of Sidney. In Scream 4, where Sidney is a successful writer, whereas Gale can't think of anything to write. But Gale does it in a much healthier way. The only aspect that I'm not really sure about with the killer reveal in Scream 3 is how they link it back to the beginning and reveal that it was actually Roman who was the puppet master behind what Billy and Stu did. And I feel like this just takes a little bit of something away from Billy and Stu, and these are two really good, really scary antagonists. And of course, through process of elimination, and because, obviously, in first place, it's the original Scream. There isn't really anything that I can say about Scream that you don't already know or you haven't already heard. We all know that Scream was a very important and groundbreaking entry into the horror genre. It refreshed horror, and particularly the slasher genre, at a time where it was on a very steep downward slope, with mostly straight-to-video releases that were sequels of franchises that had started back in the 80s. It hit that sweet spot by having that wonderful combination of a really strong script, a really strong director, and a really strong cast. And Scream was and remains just this wonderful love letter to horror and to horror fans. It also gave us some of the greatest characters within the horror genre in Sidney Prescott, Gale Weathers, Dewey Riley, Randy Meeks, and of course Ghostface. I also think that Scream has potentially one of the most terrifying opening scenes of a film, potentially any scene of a horror film. No matter how many times I watch that opening, it always gets me. The way that it builds for so long, that fear and tension, but then also the added tragic element to it when you see how close Casey Becker is to her parents, how close she is to safety, but it's not enough. And how her parents can hear her over the phone. They actually hear what happens to her. And I think that the marketing for Scream was absolutely genius. I mean, they plastered Drew Barrymore over the posters, over the trailer, in all the promo interviews. And then what do? They kill her off in the first scene. And it really sets a level of stakes and danger and tension for the rest of the characters. Because if Drew Barrymore can be killed off, anybody can be killed off. And the original Scream has an incredible third act and killer reveal. Billy Loomis and Stu Macher are two incredible antagonists that just bounce off each other so well and complement each other in their sort of yin and yang of approaches to it, attitudes to it, and motives to it as well. And Matthew Lillard chewing all the scenery is just so entertaining. I mean, he has probably he has my favourite line in the whole franchise.
My mom and dad are gonna be so mad.
So there you have it, guys, my ranking of the Scream franchise. Now, like I said in the beginning, apart from my first and my fifth place, the middle three are all pretty interchangeable. There's not a single film in this franchise that I don't like or that I think isn't a good film. And the middle three, there's a hair width between them and they're pretty interchangeable. I think that Scream is the creme de la creme. Scream 2 has some really good character scenes. Scream 3 is just a really fun time. Scream 4 is an easy rewatch, and I think that Scream 5 is a beautiful continuation of the franchise. Like I said earlier as well, I have done a standalone review of Scream 5 or Scream 2022, so if you haven't seen that already, do check that out. And I will be doing another episode ranking all of the Ghostface killers, so keep an eye out for that one. In the meantime though, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.